So in today's class, we're looking at the value of considering and studying history and tradition in our critical thinking. And we're arguing that if you look at the history of something, then you'll find out some very valuable insights that you can apply in your study. So if you're looking at education and you look at the history of education, they're very valuable insights there, whether it be a long history that goes back 2,000 years to the ancient Greeks and Hebrews, or a shorter history that goes back 100 years to what's happening in Australia. The study of history helps us to understand what is happening. Let's begin with a Bible reading from Judges 6 and Gideon. And God sent a prophet. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: I brought you out of Egypt, the land of slavery, and I rescued from the hand of Egyptians. And I delivered you from the hand of your oppressors, and I drove them out before you and gave you the land. And I said, I'm the Lord your God. Don't worship other gods. But you've not listened to me. And so through the Bible, there's a number of passages that speak of the value of history and the value of reflecting on the past, becoming wise, and recognizing that if we obey God, who's revealed himself in history, and if we become wise through learning from history, then we'll do well in life. And then Gideon was challenged. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Very positive. Pardon me, said Gideon, if the Lord is with me, why has this happened? Why are we sometimes defeated? Why do some people get into trouble? And so this is one of the questions we can ask today is, if God is involved in history, why do bad things happen to good people? And one of the answers would be that sometimes we don't obey God, and there can be other answers like the freedom that we have been given. And the book of Judges shows that when people don't listen to God, things don't go so well. When people repent and turn back to God, he raises up leaders and their fortunes can be restored. So we're going to answer this question and look for answers to this question: where is God in history, particularly when things don't go so well? We've seen another example of God in history when he raises up leaders, and each person is a leader in one sense. And to Moses, in Exodus 13:8, tell your son, it'll be like a sign, the Lord brought you out of Egypt. So the Bible records these historical accounts of where God intervenes in history, and reading these accounts in the Bible can be very encouraging to us. Of course, we can also read the book of Job where things don't go so well, and that balances different ways in which we understand God involved in history. And that's the challenge of today. I really liked it before when one of the students said, Madeline said that likes this course, I think, because it's real. It looks at the complexities of history. It puts on a thinking hat and thinks about what is happening. Let's begin with a prayer. Lord, we pray that you'll help us to understand the importance of our histories, personal and corporate and communal, and the work, sacrifice, and lives of others who've gone before us, and help us to appreciate different viewpoints, different ways of seeing our past. May we develop skills to discern what is true and real, and ways these events shape our world and the future ahead. May we have humility to admit how little we really know, and faith to submit and trust in God, who orders all things for his good. Lord, we pray, help us to appreciate the value of studying history and understanding our past, and opportunities to share these insights with others. So today we're looking at history as a way of thinking well and critically. And some of the big questions we'll be asking today: when we make decisions, we're constantly reflecting on our knowledge of history. Historians are academics who study these causal patterns to ascertain what they are. What are the patterns in history? A second big question is that if there's order in history, or is there chaos in history? Does the world get better or worse or stay the same, or is it more complex? And there are questions about free will. If God's in control of everything, there'd be no free will. But if God controls nothing, there would be no God. Thus, our theology of free will and good and evil tells us that God allows free choice, and our theology of free will and good and evil tells us something about the way God is acting in and involved in history. Genesis 50:20, as for you, you intended evil, but God intended it all for good, to preserve the lives of many people. Therefore, do not be afraid. So history reminds us also that we're human. It's a humble reminder of the strengths and weaknesses of human people. We have brilliant ideas and terrible ideas. Leaders have brilliant ideas and terrible ideas. And children today must grow up to know that there are various types of human communities other than their own, to appreciate the differences in different communities, and every community has strengths and weaknesses. Every leader has strengths and weaknesses. And one of the things that will stand out today is that sometimes we can overemphasize either the weaknesses of some humans or the strengths of some humans. So why study history? We'll argue that our lives are constantly benefiting from our knowledge of what's happened in the past. So if you buy a car, I remember buying my first car, and you ask others what's their history and experience in buying cars, and you make a decision. If you buy a second-hand one, what sort of car? So looking at the past and other people's accounts of the past, we try and understand why things are the way they are. Why study history? We study history to study change. Historians are trained to examine and interpret human identities and the nature of change in people and society and civilizations over time. History is also about continuity and discontinuity. And in the Bible, we see examples of continuity. In the Old Testament, we read about the Exodus, the sacrifices, the tabernacle and temple, and building of a kingdom under Kings David and Solomon. And in the New Testament, we read about the prayer for thy kingdom come. We read about the temple, and we read about sacrifices. But also, history is about discontinuity. And in the New Testament, Jesus and Paul in their writings speak about a revolutionary change in which we love our enemies, that we speak of Father God and a willingness to go to the cross for one's faith in God. So Jesus brings about revolutionary change. So there's continuity and discontinuity in history. The Protestant Reformation is another example with Martin Luther. He continued in faith in the Bible that the Roman Church were reading from, but at the same time, he also spoke in terms of discontinuity. That is, our faith should be in God and in his grace, rather than seeking works to bring change and transformation. There's a discontinuity there. He challenged the notion of purgatory and payment of money to spend lesser time in purgatory, because he felt that was a corruption of what was in the Bible. So continuity and discontinuity. And if you were to do a historical study of Christianity in Christian schools today, you could look at continuity. There's continuity with the secular schools. There's continuity with the way schooling was done 50 or 100 years ago. But there's discontinuity. We've got laptops, and we've got differences to the secular schools as well. So understanding history is understanding relationships with the past, lessons that we can learn from the past. And also it's understanding the ways that history and stories can be told. Some can be true and accurate, and then others can be less accurate. And in assignment 2, we're asking you to think about various ways of thinking critically, but you can also think about your history and the ways that you've understood history. Sometimes you can be told a false history that changes your view of history. For instance, I had wondered, well, when I was a child, could I become an astronaut? And I asked someone, and they said, no, you're an Australian, you've got to be American or Russian to become an astronaut. So I've never pursued a goal to become an astronaut. However, in my 30s, I discovered 2 Australians have become astronauts. So the false history that has been told to me has stopped me from becoming an Australian astronaut. There may be other things that have stopped me from becoming an Australian astronaut as well, but false histories can shape your lives and can shape the lives of nations. Even in the war being fought at the moment, there are various stories being told, various histories being told. Some are more accurate than others. So let's begin with an exercise. I want you to choose one day last week, and then I want you to think of some other days last week. Can I get you to write down what's an event on one day last week that stood out to you? And I want you to think about what stood out. Was it a job situation? Was it a school situation? What was it last week on that particular day that stood out to you? And I want you to recognize that as we recall in history some things that happen, there are various developments that cause us to see the importance of those developments. Something that's unusual and different often stands out. And then there are things that are less usual. So what are some things that stood out to you from 1 week ago? Stephanie, what stood out to you from 1 week ago on one day, while others are writing down what stood out to them?
Last week I so I'm a nurse is my previous profession, and I've had a bit of a break from that since about before Christmas, but I had my first shift back at the hospital on Wednesday night. So that was kind of a bit nerve-wracking going back after such a long break. So yeah, it stood out to me because like things that used to be so easy for me to do, I really had to think about because I've had such a long break. I had to look up medications, which I used to give all the time and that sort of thing. So yeah, that was something different.
And that would suggest that our minds recall those events that are different and significant in order for us to learn. And I think history is the same. That is, there's a personal history, and you could keep a journey. And hands up anyone who keeps a journal. And so if you keep a journal, you can write down those things. Yeah. So what's the value of keeping a journal, Gabrielle?
I personally have really valued like keeping a journal, not like in the moment being like, oh, I'd get to write all this down, but looking back at what I've written like 5 years ago and just seeing everything in a bigger picture and being like, I thought this was so big when I wrote it down, and I thought that this boy not texting me back was the worst thing that would ever happen in my life, but it actually puts everything into perspective. So that's where I find a lot of value in it, to be able to figure out my life in a bigger picture.
And I think that's what history does, doesn't it? Is that historians record what has happened, novelists record what has happened. And so history is about these recordings, and you can record your personal history in journal writing. Yeah, Noah, what stood out to you one day from last week?
Well, last week I got food poisoning, so that kind of stuck out to me a bit. That kind of ruined my day and the next day, but yeah.
And so you learn lessons from history, and it's stuck
Absolutely.
in your mind.
Absolutely. Don't eat the 2-week-old lasagna in the fridge.
Wow. My children tell me that, but I'm still not sure whether I'm going to follow their advice as yet, because it looks so good, doesn't it? But
it does. Doesn't feel great though.
And so I think each one of us have events that stand out to us, and by keeping a diary, then you can record those events. Sometimes these recordings are very personal, and I know when I wrote my PhD, I included some personal reflections there, and I began part of my PhD, which you can see online on the megachurches. It includes some reflections. Martin Luther, Eric Erickson, wrote Stages of Development, but he also wrote a book, Young Man Luther, in which he reflects on personal development. Robert Clinton, in The Making of a Leader, talks about the importance of reflecting on your personal history. So your lives have history, and then everything has a history, and there is collective memory that collects these different histories together. Can I get you to write down the names of these two people that you see here from history from 100 or 200 years or a bit longer ago? So can get everyone to write down the names of these two people, significant figures in history. And this will go 80% towards the marks at the end of this subject. Hopefully you saw the irony in that statement, the humor in that statement. And Ruben, can you tell us the names of either of those two figures?
No. I'll take a wild guess and I'll say Bob and Jono, but that's about as close as I'm going to get.
Yep. Chloe,
I
can you
reckon-
tell us? Yeah, what about Chloe? Can you tell us? Or Jasmine?
I don't even have a wild guess, honestly.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
important people.
Jasmine?
I don't, no idea. Sorry.
Yeah.
Is the guy on the left Napoleon?
was gonna say
Exactly,
that.
and Gabrielle was going to say.
Oh,
Napoleon.
sorry.
That's what I
sorry,
was going to
Gabby.
say, but it's fine. I have my
That's
hand.
okay.
up.
You know the person on the right, don't you? I'll let you have that.
No, it's okay. I'll leave it to someone else.
And the person on the right is Shaka Zulu. And this example is meant to point out that our history tends to be Western Europe oriented. That is, we then face a challenge in that if our history is Western Europe oriented, then is that good or bad? Any thoughts, Shyla? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that our history is Western Europe oriented, going back to Aristotle and Plato in Greece, and the Caesars in Rome, and then through to Britain and kings and queens?
Well,
Shyla?
that is the most relevant part of like history to how we got to where we are. But in terms of like where we are now, like it's definitely has a lot of value to know about other cultures and other religions and things that have like got us where we are in terms of the rest of the world. When I did studies of religion, I felt like having those insights, like everything's connected, whether or not you think it is or not, like it's all really linked. And like different things that I'm like, I'd never really known anything about Islam, or I went to a school and I picked studies of religion thinking, oh yes, I'll smash this, I'll get Christianity and I'll kill the HSC. No, Islam, Buddhism and Hinduism, which I had never heard of apart from the names really. And yeah, it's just so funny how many things link and how we all have similar like where things came from in history, like not just with religion, but for this example, like it's all, we all have our own story that's like sort of the same, but like an adaptation that suits our worldview kind of thing. It's really interesting.
And these are such important points to recognise that the other national religions are so important for us to understand those religions. The other national cultures are so important to understand. But at the same time, if we live in a country that's been settled by Europeans, or if we live in Europe, then European history is also particularly important. And so you can study Western civilizations. And while one can say with a high degree of confidence that Western civilization has had a massive influence on the globe, and we can celebrate those developments, we also need to be careful that we don't forget to recognise the other religions and other developments as well. So what is history? History is made, not discovered. So it's the way we tell the events that have occurred. History is creative, so we bring some of our subjective viewpoints to it. It may be scientific, where we can analyse it, but it also can be literary, but it's not pure fiction. It's a way of telling what has happened, and it includes narrative, and it includes a rigorous study of evidence, but we don't always get the evidence totally right. What facts are selected? You select the facts according to your interest, and you and I may focus on Christian aspects, and we may focus on a particular denomination of a church that we attend, and in assignment 2, you might want to include that. However, there is selection bias in that history is written by the victors. For instance, in South Korea, if you go to the museum there, which I've done, you have wonderful stories of the victories of the South Koreans. But if you go to North Korea, which I've not done, then you would find that they tell the stories of victories of the North Koreans. So selection bias is one of the big concerns in history. And even in telling your own story and history, you probably need some encouragement to have some negative stories in your own personal histories. And so in your journal and in nursing, I'm told that you need to keep a journal each week or so and write down the things that don't go so well, because they're the things that you learn from. Let's have a look at some examples of selection bias here. And so Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933, and in 1934 he gathers huge numbers of people in Nuremberg for a National Socialist rally of the great things that will be achieved. And one of the things he's saying is that the German people who have been smashed up in World War I can rally together, and they can make the people's car, the Volkswagen, and they can build their nation, and it can be the greatest nation on earth. And some of may have heard politicians say similar things in the last few years or few months even. And so a film was made of this by Leni Riefenstahl, in which she'd get down low and film up to Hitler as he spoke. And it really showed how powerful he was as a leader and the great things that were going to unfold for Germany in the years ahead. And it was called The Triumph of the Will. And so thousands gathered, and the filmmaker, Lena Riefenstahl, artfully showed the German Chancellor, Hitler, and the National Socialist Party gathering together and getting ready. And so this is history. It's recording actual events, and it's recording great hopes, and using these low angles to show the great leader. She was able to record that. And this raises the thought that if Germany had won the war, or if a peace had been settled, this may be the history that was recorded. There may not be other histories. So do you have some thoughts on this telling of history in this film, Triumph of the Will? So any thoughts? Hands up. Videos switched on for this. Aidan, do you have thoughts on this recording of history? The great service.
Are you specifically talking about how it's written by the victors, or this specific?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the truth and bias in this film?
So my other elective is history. It's my minor.
Wow. Yes.
And so it has been really interesting reading through war sources and how like the state of the war affects how it's recorded. Because I think we always think that like even you think of wars where Australia or the West has been on like the good guy side. And we think, oh, we would never do the same. Like we would never change sources. We would never record in a way that makes us look good. But it's really interesting seeing how, well, of course, the Nazis are the bad guys. Like I don't want to sound like I'm defending them, but there are things that we do where we try and cover up atrocities at a lower level, but still horrible things. And we get to do it because we won and we were the good guys.
Yeah, yeah, so true. And that's exactly right. And then if we were to then look at another recording of World War II, Night and Fog is a French documentary made about Auschwitz in 1955, also using original film from the time. But in this film that is made at Auschwitz and Dachau and other prison camps where I've been able to go and visit some of these, and then the accounts in the Holocaust museums, we see that shower blocks were built and people were marched in to the shower blocks and the doors were locked and closed, and then poison gas was dropped in, and it takes 5, 10, 20 minutes or whatever for the people to die in those shower blocks, sometimes 2,000 at a time. And then they bring them out and put them into ovens and burn those people. And up to 6 million people died in that genocide. And so this is another way of telling the history of World War II. This then raises the question, and maybe Aidan again, is there bias or true history in the Holocaust recordings? What are your thoughts on the Holocaust recordings, Aidan?
It's funny because there's been a movement that I don't know how recent it is, but I feel like it's kicked up recently of like trying to dismiss how horrible the Holocaust was by revising sources. But from what I've seen, and I'm so not a professional in this, I'm very much still an amateur. What I've seen is that actually we have really good resources for the Holocaust that actually comes from some of them from Germany's own bookkeeping as to just how massive in scale it was and just how many people went through, and like exactly what this source is saying with the horrible process of lining them up and literally just indiscriminately killing.
Yeah. And certainly the Holocaust museums, which you see in Jerusalem and in the USA and Europe, keep those records. And certainly you can even get sponsorship and payment if you were interested in finding out more. And there's interviews that people do with people, others there in the Holocaust museums. And so, and you can visit Auschwitz and Dachau and other places. So these are accounts of bias and history, and there's a mixture of both in these accounts. And so these are the sort of questions we're asking in the study of history, in that everything has a history, and every person has a history, and every nation has a history, and every war has a history, and every item, whether it be an iPad or iPhone, has a history. But the story of that history can be told in different ways. And so one of the challenges that we have to look at is the way the stories are told. One way the story is told is through the great man view of history. And in the great man view of history is that World War II in Germany was largely the actions of Hitler, and then the dreadful people who followed him, and then the trial that occurred afterwards when 20 or more people were put on trial. And then the English victory in World War II was led by Churchill. And so the great man view of history looks to great leaders and what they've accomplished. So Stephanie, do you have any thoughts on what the strengths and weaknesses of the great man view of history? Thomas Carlyle describes it as the great men who accomplish so much in history. Thomas Carlyle says, the history of what man has accomplished in this world is at the bottom, the history of the great men, the models and modelers, the patterns, the creators, whatsoever the general mass of men contrive to do or to attain. All things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer material result, the practical realization, embodiment, and thoughts that dwell in the great men sent into the world, the soul of the whole world's history. It may justly be considered were the histories of these? So Stephanie, and then others, if you want to put up a hand if you have thoughts on the great man view of history.
I think there's definitely merit in that kind of view of history, because obviously you can't get into history of absolutely every person or everything that's going on at one time. So I suppose they have, like, these great men have great influence, I suppose. So I guess their effect on history and what comes after their time is probably like notable to look at. But I guess the limitations in that is it's only looking at a very, very small kind of sample size, like the great men and their followers. Whereas, you know, if we're looking at Churchill, what's going on with the rest of the people in the country, like what's their life like at this time? If we're just looking at, I guess, the leader of the country, we're kind of forgetting about the common people and how that's influenced history as well. So, yeah.
And that's the challenge of history and historians, is to recognize that we cannot put every person and every event in history. So we've got to select particular people and particular events. But in more recent times, historians have tried to look for more people and also to look for more events. And so rather than saying that just one event was the major event, they look now at lots of events. And instead of saying one person, more recently, people have recognised that women may be involved in history. And so that includes another 50% of the world. And the common people may be involved. And every organisation can include a history of its organisation. However, again, there's a tendency, whether it be a sports group or whether it be a particular church group, there's a tendency over time to focus more on males, to focus more on significant figures, even if they're not so significant. It's the dominant figures, it's the victors that are being focused on. Thomas O'Day called this the dilemmas of institutionalization. And he said that institutionalization, even though history is complex, institutionalization will tend to oversimplify it and lift up a few prominent males who are going to be described there.
Just before we go on, I had some points, but before I start, Gabby, did you have something you wanted to say?
Thank you, Noah. I just wanted, like, what we were talking about before with the great men discussion and the quote that you read about, like, the history, like our history as a society being made up of their history. I think that's, yeah, right at the end where it says thoughts that dwelt in the great men sent into the world, the soul of the whole world history, it may justly be considered were the history of these. And while I think that there's merit in identifying people who have great ideas and who have led a movement, I also think that it's a bit far-fetched to say that, you know, the soul of the world's history was made on these men, because no, it was also made of the history of the man who was conscripted and taken out of his home. And it was made up of the history of the woman who signed up to be a nurse because she just wanted to do something, and of the man who got left at home because he was deaf and was, like, it was considered he couldn't fight. And so I think it's far-fetched to just say that the world's history is made from these great men when there are great men who haven't been recognized by history and great women who haven't been recognized by history that contribute to who we are and why we're here.
So good. Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Not related to that, but related to what Stephanie was saying about how the history, we can't, like, not every historical event can be recorded. It made me wonder, well, with the rise of social media and the constant updates and stuff, will that then, you know, assuming the internet continues to last, because if the internet's gone, so is any history, kind of, because all of it's online. That's the point. If it stays, then, you know, we have kind of hourly by hourly updates about how Joe Blow on the side of the streets feeling, or, you know, some seagull came and stole his hot dog. And it's like, well, okay, sick. But what can we actually learn from that? Like, does that have an impact moving on? Or is that just kind of like an impact on their life and then that subsequent sphere of influence they have in the lives of the people around them, even if that doesn't necessarily impact my life? That makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you raise a very good point. If social media continues and we preserve more of history, that could give people more to study. There's also the danger of false media and false histories. And then there's the danger it could all be lost, like cassette recorders and VHS. Every time that there is a media change, then a lot of history is lost. And so we can preserve a lot of history, we can lose a lot of history. Certainly the reality is that most history is lost. You only have to go to a funeral and they sum up a person's life in about 20 minutes. And then a week or two afterwards or so, there's some record of their life, and sometimes 300 pages of a book sums up their life, but it's only a small portion of their life. And you meet people who maybe no one shows up at their funeral and no book has ever written about them. So a huge amount of history is lost. And it's the job of the historian to preserve history. Any other thoughts on great men view of history? Perhaps starting with Noah, but or Madeline, and then maybe Noah as well.
Yeah, I tend to think that the great man view of history, which is, I guess, building off what Gabby said as far as not considering like other men and women, but I often feel like it's used to justify the cost of human life. So we talk about one man being, you know, attempted assassinations or whatever's going on, while hundreds of thousands of men and women and children in many cases are either displaced or die during war. And I think that by focusing on a great man, it can be a propaganda tool to keep the focus off the actual cost of conflict or even just major world events on the everyday person. So when you can say this person rose to power and they won this war, I'm like, well, all the people whose people didn't come home from war probably don't feel like they won that war, who went through major famine, financial downturn because of the cost of the war. But at least we have this person to kind of raise up. And I think that they actually did that in a very different way in Australia, especially through the Second World War, but even somewhat through the First, with that idea of the unknown soldier and then the Anzacs. We transitioned from having like a great leader of Australia to having this Anzac narrative that was really about honoring the people, and then obviously the ideal qualities of the Australian man or women. Anyone can have the Anzac spirit, but like the soldier and mateship and hard work and resilience and sticking it out, and transitioning from this idea of honoring one person while hundreds of thousands die to honoring the people that were dying. And I'm sure that might have happened in other cultures, but obviously I haven't learned about that. But that transition to Anzac narrative is more honoring the people rather than honoring the great leader.
That's so well said. And a bottom-up every person narrative instead of top-down leader gives greater recognition. And at Anzac Cove in Turkey, in some ways we were defeated. And interestingly, Rupert Murdoch's grandfather went to visit there, and then went on in World War One, I think, and went to England. They then took his notes off him because they didn't want him to tell the truth of what was happening in the loss of so many lives. So Anzac, I think you make the point well, Madeline, reminds us of the ordinary person and loss that's so often overlooked in war. I think that's very well said. Noah, do you have further thoughts on great man view, bottom-up view, where every person is observed and described, or other thoughts?
Kind of what I thought was interesting about what Maddie was saying was, I wonder if like governments and even the media chooses specific figures to focus on as a bit of a smoke screen, so they don't actually, they're like, well, if this person can survive, if this person's happening, then that's what we count as the win, so that the people aren't looking at the actual loss that's happening all around them. Because it's like, well, people might be dying, but if, say, I don't know, if, say, who's a historical figure? I don't know. Let's say the Queen, for example. If the Queen's still alive and kicking, 90 years later, well, what does that mean then for all of the colonization that happened from the British Empire? Does that mean then, as long as she's going, it's fine, and the royal family's still intact and that's fine? Or is it kind of the same as, oh, well, if we kill Hitler, then we win. World War II has ended. That's the decision made for everyone. And it makes me wonder, do we then, as a society, try to almost tokenize and then subsequently idolize specific people, so we can put as kind of as a mascot or an icon of the war or the situation that's going on, and we use them to represent either success or loss, depending on if they survive or not. Or then again, subsequently, their choices that they make and how they affect the people. Because if a leader goes and, does all this stuff and causes heaps of loss of life, but they win, then they're a good leader. But if they lose, all of a sudden, how could this person, send all these people into war? How could they be responsible for this death? They didn't do anything. And it's like, well, are you saying that the ends justify the means? Or are you saying, is there a value of life? And then if that's the case, how can you say that just because someone's in leadership, their life is worth more, or their values or decisions are more important than the people that it actually is also affecting on a ground level?
Yeah, so good. And so media can have a media spin to it. And as you say, you can idolize specific people in media, but there's also a positive role of media. And so I think you really raised very well, Noah, the danger of the media spin, which can be telling a story for all sorts of reasons. And media is full of that. And then there is the positive side of journalism, which uncovers important aspects. Ruben.
Yes, I was just going to talk about whilst it is good to focus on the general population, if we're going to be talking about individuals at the bottom level, I'm just going to, not saying bottom as in inferior or anything, but bottom as in not a leader of countries and stuff. All of a sudden, you have to make huge generalizations for everyone. Otherwise, you're going to have to talk about every single individual. So I feel like then you're swinging in a lot more bias. So why is it that when we hear about the Anzacs, for example, going off of that, we only hear the positives say? I'm sure there is guaranteed to be, if you went and spoke to other people that aren't Australia or whatever, I'm sure that there'd be negative interpretations of the same story. And I feel like by focusing on the individual leader at the top, you're focusing, because they're the representative of their country. So especially when you're talking on a global scale, if you're focusing on the top, then you're seeing everything revolves around their views, because they're the ones calling the shots. So if you're wanting to focus on the big picture, that's where you need to go, I feel.
And do you have any thoughts on, instead of just focusing on the heroic soldier in Anzacs, what about the soldier who has a breakdown, fear, who runs the other way? They're important stories too. And that's part of the reality of human nature, which I think is what history should do. And sometimes fiction can tell that, or fiction based on reality can be a way of telling that. But you've got to be careful, because that gets away from true history as well. Any other thoughts on history and the great heroes and the ordinary everyday people. I like that point that you make about generalizations versus individuals. And we've got to look at the complexity of humans and human nature, don't we, as well? Let's take our 10-minute break there, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes' time and look further at the way in which in our critical thinking we can learn from history, we can learn the value of historical information, we can watch out for biases, whether it be wrong views of the great heroes or wrong views about the ordinary everyday people. History, I guess, is representative. That is, that you keep records that represent something. And in your own personal histories, looking back on last week, you collect some ideas that are representative of events that happen in your lives. And I guess a balanced life record is one that records the good views and the good developments and the not so good. But we need a lot of good ones too to remind us of the value that we have. So see you shortly in about 10 minutes' time.